All right, hello everybody, and thanks for following along. Here's a glance at the Superlite coupe chassis. In this video, we are going to mount the uprights, the front and rear uprights to the chassis. Before we get started with that, I did want to revisit the installation of the A-arms, and as you can see, I mean, they're all put on. I have spent quite a bit of time adjusting the sort of these mounting tabs. I wouldn't say adjusting the mounting tabs, but getting the spacing of these washers correct. And one thing, I really didn't understand how this suspension works, but I thought the suspension rotated on the shoulder bolts, but actually what you do is you torque these down, and the safety washers pinch and secure the ball in the rod end, and actually the suspension rotates on the rod end, so there's absolutely zero play in the whole assembly. And one thing I think you have to pay some attention to is, like I mentioned, I sort of pre-adjusted these brackets, which in hindsight, was not a good move. But basically, once you tighten these up, and all these are tightened up but they're not torqued, you basically want to have sort of zero play back and forth with the suspension arm, and then all you're doing is applying, when you tighten the bracket up, you're applying pressure to the ball. If it's not centered in the bracket, you're sort of pushing one fork, in or out, and that's not good. So, I have some different size spacers, and very careful I went through each corner and got them just right. So, at this point, we're now ready to put the uprights on, so that's what we'll cover in this video. All right, so let's get started with the front uprights. Here are really all the components I need to put these things on the car. I'm going to install all the uprights. I'm not putting the wheel bearings on yet. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually coat the suspension with this product called Ballistol. This is a metal preservative. It stops the aluminum from oxidizing. It works pretty good, but I will tell you, it smells putrid. I mean, it is absolutely a disgusting smell. But I've already coated the upper and lower A-arms, so I'll coat these before I put them on the car. Some people will anodize the suspension or powder coat it. I sort of like the aluminum look, and if you use this Ballistol once a year, it supposedly keeps the parts looking new for a long time. Let's see, what's the hardware we're going to use here. So we have the shoulder bolts, and you'll see how these get orientated. The only thing I did was I sprayed the tops of these with some clear coat, since they're really not sort of not rust proof, so I coated that. We just have some 5/8 inch safety washers, an assortment of different 5/8 inch washers for the job. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, well, the first step is really just to apply some anti-seize on the tapered area on the ball joint, make it a little easier if I do have to separate the upright from the ball joint at some point. I'll just slide them on, and then I'll attach the upper control arm with the shoulder bolt that you saw in the prior segment. Okay, well, the first step is really just to apply some anti-seize on the tapered area on the ball joint, make it a little easier if I do have to separate the upright from the ball joint at some point. I'll just slide them on, and then I'll attach the upper control arm with the shoulder bolt that you saw in the prior segment. Okay, well, we've got the upright on. We'll take a closer look here. You can see there's a castle nut, which is typical when you install a ball joint, and then there's a stack of washers. What Superlite recommends is once you torque that bolt down and figure out how many washers you need to replace that stack with a single steel spacer, and I can fab that up. What some guys do is they use a taller half-inch lock nut and a single washer, but I'll probably stick with the castle nut because that's sort of the industry practice. Also, let's see, to get the top A-arm on the upright, we apply some anti-seize in the hole and also on the top, and we're applying anti-seize on this 5/8 inch shoulder bolt and also the safety washer. So that's what we're going to put together next. Okay, well, we got the front upright on. It's not secured. I actually have to get some distorted lock nuts. That's what I want to use for the bottom of that shoulder bolt. I'll put a washer and a distorted lock nut on it. But it is looking good. So I'm going to temporarily attach the steering tie rod just to get the parts in place. But that steering rack has to come off. I've got to weld in those top mounting holes and then re-drill them. But I'm going to finish with the left front, and then we'll do the rears. Okay, well, I got the steering tie rod in. I'm not going to tighten this up, but a couple comments. I mean, I'm all the way threaded in on this tie rod, and I certainly don't think I have any toe in. I probably got a hair toe out, and I do think the rack gets shipped as it's centered, so I may have to trim the edge of this down, which is no big deal. Let's see, I put this assembly together, so one thing to note, sort of a best practice, you can see the shoulder of that bolt just sort of peeking out. So you always want the shoulder of the bolt, you know, with these spacers, just so you get a really good fit, and it's not, you know, it's the strongest part of the bolt is the shoulder. I could always trim these up a little bit if I don't like the way they look, but you know, this is sort of the assembly. Okay, it looks pretty cool. Have no idea if that's zero camber, but I've got to take some measurements and then we'll see. But I'm going to finish up the other corners, and I'll show a couple things as I go along. All right, well, before I start with the rears, I actually did a couple things on the front. So, you know, one thing you want to set on suspension is bump steer. And bump steer, you know, this isn't all about the alignment, but you want to try to match the angle that the tie rod, the steering tie rod, is positioned at with the lower control arm. So I just put a level on those two areas, and it turned out by adding these two little washers between the safety washer, I got within like 0.2 of a degree. So that was sort of interesting. It's pretty much dead on. Now that may change once I set the ride height up, but just figured I'd take a stab at that. It does appear though that I have to trim the steering rack a little bit, you know, the threads on the ends. And the other thing is I did check to see if we were at zero camber, and you know what? One side was like 89.7 and the other side was like 89.8 degrees. So, and that may change depending upon ride height too, but it seems like that default setting worked pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the back and we'll take it from there. Okay, well, we've got the uprights installed. We don't have the top shoulder bolts put in yet, but I did make an executive decision with regard to these castle nuts and the washers underneath them. I'm actually, at least for now, I'm going to go with a lock nut instead of the castle nut. I mean, a number of the other builders have gone this direction, and they've had their cars on the road for quite a while and they haven't had any issues. Also, the track day suspension does not use the castle nuts because they have spherical spherical rod ends instead of ball joints. So because this ball joint is an OEM part, that's why it comes with the castle nut. Also, if we take a look at this castle nut, I mean, the castle nut's really not very substantial. I mean that's a 1/2 inch fine grain nut, and look at the difference between this grade 8 lock nut, much more substantial. Okay, so I think I'll be okay. All right, we're on to the next step here, and the parts you're looking at are really to assemble the rear toe link. So these are the toe spacers. This is the toe rod that holds the toe spacers onto the upright, and then these are the toe links, and but these are just some more beautiful parts delivered by RCR. I mean, these are steel, they're plated. You have the left and a right hand hind joint, so as you spin the rod, it'll add toe or subtract toe. So they're really nice pieces. So we're going to put these on the car, and that'll be the final step for today. Okay, so here's a little work in process with regard to the toe link. So let's see, we've attached the toe rod to the chassis, and now what we have to do is we have to put these aluminum spacers and some other washers onto the upright. And we have this really long 1/2 inch bolt, and I already put the other side on, so you'll get a view of this in the next segment. But this is sort of interesting. I marked this bolt red over here and also red down here, and these are such long bolts that they literally are not 100% straight. So when I was putting the first one together, I thought maybe had an issue with the way I lined up the top and the bottom, but basically if I line these two holes correct, it goes there, and then you have to thread it actually through here. I didn't want to have to sand this out or enlarge this, because you want this as tight as possible. The other thing is, we're using these small washers, and we want to really take up all the slack. There can't be any slack whatsoever, because you want the end of the toe link rod to be pressed in tightly. I think the better way of assembling this, because I've looked at some other pictures, is I probably should not have put this lower toe link bar until I was ready to assemble everything and then get it in place and then tighten it up, because the other pictures show 2 large washers on the bottom, where I can only use 1 large washer and then these 3 smaller washers. But they actually work well, and they take up all the slack. I literally have to tap it to get it all the parts in place. And then once you tighten it, there'll be some amount of bend as you torque this up, and it'll clamp it in really nicely. But anyway, you got to just go slow and think these things through, but it's looking good. All right, well, I have the rear uprights installed, and we're really done with all the work for this particular video. But let's take a closer look. I've got a couple things I wanted to point out. So you can see this toe link rod is installed, and that toe link rod, the rod end here is held together by pressing this whole stack. But as I showed in the prior segment, you have to get these washers nice and tight and sort of tap in the last washer, and then once it's tightened up, it applies enough torque for that rod end that it's rock solid. So anyway, you can see how easy it is. The camera's probably going to shake a little bit, but you just spin this arm, and you can see it's just adding to the toe end. So it's very easy to dial in the toe in on the Superlite coupe. Also, I had to back this rod end out 2 more full turns to get the rear uprights to 0 zero camber. Now, I don't know if the ride height is set properly, so you know that may be adjusted. But anyway, it's you know, it's looking good. We've got everything put together. Let's do sort of a final view here. Well, it's a little sunny here in the garage. But anyway, there's the front suspension. We got the rear suspension. And let's see, you know, next up, the next set of videos, I've got some work to do on the wheel bearings, so I'll walk you through that. And the overall goal is to be able to get the wheels and tires on the car and get the body on the car, so I can see how much room I have to mount intercoolers, to, you know, at what angle I can mount this radiator so it clears the nose. You know, I need some extra room there because of the fan shroud and the power brake. So that's really the main reason I want to get the body on sooner rather than later. Okay, well, thanks for watching and take care. Bye.